My name is Harriet Voss, and if you stay with me to the end of this story, you will understand why the quietest people in any room are often the most dangerous ones to underestimate. But before I tell you how everything unfolded, I need to take you back to the night my own son stood up at his rehearsal dinner in front of 50 people and told them all, with a smile on his face, that I was the family embarrassment they had learned to manage. That was the night I decided to stop being managed. I raised my son alone after my husband passed from a heart attack when our boy was 11 years old. We lived in a small split-level inn, Kanata, just west of Ottawa, and I worked as an administrative coordinator for a mid-sized engineering firm for most of his childhood. Nothing glamorous. I packed lunches, drove him to hockey practice, helped with science fair projects, and spent most weekends doing the kind of quiet, unremarkable mothering that nobody ever photographs or puts on a wall. He was the center of my world. I thought I was the center of his. His name is Connor. He is 41 years old, tall like his father, and carries himself with the particular confidence of a man who has mistaken luck for talent. I say that not with cruelty, but with the clarity that only time and heartbreak can give you. He married a woman named Felicity 3 years ago, the daughter of a property developer from West Vancouver. The moment he met her family, something shifted in him. Not overnight, the way a light switches off, but slowly, the way a photograph fades when left in too much sun. He started making small comments about my neighborhood, about my car, which was a 2009 Civic and ran perfectly well, about the way I dressed when I visited them in their condo in Westmount. Nothing sharp enough to call out without sounding thin-skinned, just enough to let me know I was being appraised and found lacking. His fiancée was not unkind, exactly, but she had a way of smiling at things I said that made me feel like a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. Her mother, a woman named Vivienne who wore silk scarves even at brunch, once asked me very sweetly what it was I actually did for work. When I said I was retired, she nodded in a way that meant she had already assumed as much and filed me somewhere appropriate in her mind. I let it go. I always let it go. That is a habit I developed early and held on to too long. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private room in a restaurant on Rue Saint-Denis in Montreal, because Felicity's family had strong opinions about venues, and Connor had long since stopped having opinions of his own in their presence. I drove myself down from Ottawa. I wore a navy dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I had my hair done. I arrived early because that is what I do. The evening started well enough. There were speeches, there were toasts, and then Connor stood up, loosened by wine and emboldened by an audience that adored him, and he told a story. He framed it as affectionate, the way people do when they want cruelty to slide past undetected. He talked about growing up with a mother who clipped coupons and drove a used car, and once returned a birthday gift because the receipt was still in the bag. The table laughed. His future in-laws laughed the loudest. Vivienne pressed her hand to her chest as though the story were charming, and Connor smiled out at the room, never once looking directly at me, and said, "We've spent years figuring out how to include her without it becoming a whole thing." Without it becoming a whole thing. I sat at that table with my hands flat on my lap and my face arranged into something neutral, and I made myself breathe. Felicity's father caught my eye briefly and glanced away. The woman seated beside me laughed and then seemed to remember I was there and touched my arm in a way that was worse than the laughter. I did not cry. I did not excuse myself. I sat with it the way you sit with a burn, staying very still and waiting for the worst of it to pass. What none of them knew, what Connor himself did not fully understand, was that the woman they were laughing at had been quietly building something for the better part of 2 decades. Not for show, not for moments like this. I had been building it because after my husband died and I was left with a mortgage and a child, and the terrifying understanding that no one was coming to rescue me, I decided the only safety I could trust was the kind I made myself. I started small. A second property purchased in 2004 with money I had saved obsessively for 6 years, a duplex in Veneer that most people thought was a terrible neighborhood at the time. I rented both units, managed them myself, learned as I went. I read every book I could find on real estate investment and tax structure, and I took an evening course at Algonquin College. I reinvested every dollar I made. By 2010, I had 4 properties. By 2015, 11. By the time Connor stood up at that rehearsal dinner and told his future in-laws that I was a logistical inconvenience, I held majority interest in a small private real estate holding company with assets across Ontario and British Columbia, managed under a numbered company that had never once been connected to my name in any conversation Connor had heard. I also held a significant ownership stake in a commercial property management firm based in Calgary, a firm that had recently been contracted by Felicity's father's development company to manage 3 of his newer properties in the Lower Mainland. Felicity's father knew my numbered company. He had shaken hands with my property manager. He had signed contracts that flowed, in ways he had not traced, back to me. He had been in the room at that dinner. He had laughed. I want to be honest about what I felt driving home from Montreal that night. It was not some clean, cinematic resolve. It was grief, mostly. The particular grief of watching someone you raised and loved and sacrificed for choose freely to be ashamed of you. Connor had not been forced to tell that story. Nobody had dared him. He had picked it up and used it as currency with people whose approval he wanted more than he wanted my dignity. That is not something you recover from quickly. That is something you carry. But underneath the grief, something else was settling. The way sediment settles after a river has been disturbed. Patience. I had built my entire financial life on patience. I knew, in a way I cannot fully explain, that what had happened at that dinner would eventually matter in a different way than Connor imagined. I did not rush. That is the thing people never understand about building anything real. You cannot rush it. You tend it. You wait. The wedding was beautiful. I will give them that. Held at a vineyard in the Okanagan in late August. The kind of day where the light is golden and even people who dislike each other look like they are in harmony. I was seated at a table near the back with Felicity's aunt and 2 cousins she appeared not to speak to. Not at the family table, not beside my son. I told myself it was a seating chart error. I knew it was not. After the ceremony, Felicity's father, whose name is Douglas, made his way to my table to say hello. He was gracious in the practice way of men who are very good at being gracious when it costs them nothing. We spoke for a few minutes about the venue, about the drive from Kelowna, about the weather. He did not ask about my work. When he moved on, I watched him go and thought about the contract renewal his firm had coming up in October. The months that followed the wedding were ordinary on the surface. Connor called occasionally, mostly to share news about the renovation they were doing on a property in NDG they had just purchased together. He spoke about it with the breathless excitement of someone who has just discovered something the rest of the world already knew. He told me about their contractor, their permit timelines, their plans to rent the top floor and live on the lower 2 levels. He asked me once, almost as an afterthought, whether I thought the Montreal market was still worth investing in. I told him it depended on the fundamentals. He did not ask what I meant. What Connor did not know was that the contractor he had hired had also bid on 2 of my commercial projects that year. When that contractor ran into a cash flow problem in February, the kind that comes from taking on too much work without enough capital, the financing he applied for through a private lender was reviewed by a company I had a quiet interest in. The review was thorough. The timeline was slow. It was not malicious. It was simply business conducted carefully. Connor called me in March, frustrated. He said the Reno was stalled. He said the contractor had gone quiet. He said he could not understand why everything was taking so long when they had a tenant waiting. I listened. I told him that delays in construction are almost always about money, and money problems are almost always about people overextending themselves. He said that was not helpful. I said I understood. Meanwhile, Douglas's property management contract came up for renewal in October as I had expected. My property management firm, through its Calgary operation, submitted a renewal proposal with revised terms, not unreasonable terms, but different terms, terms that reflected the current market and that reduced the operating margin Douglas's company had been counting on. His team pushed back. Negotiations extended. The relationship that had felt comfortable and automatic was no longer either of those things. I was told, through the ordinary channels of business communication, that Douglas had been frustrated by the process, that he had said the previous arrangement had been simpler. I was not surprised. In the spring, Connor and Felicity came to visit me in Ottawa for a long weekend. I made a roast, the same one I had made on Sunday nights throughout his entire childhood, and we sat at my kitchen table and I watched my son look around my house with the particular expression of someone who is doing mental math about what things cost. Felicity was pleasant. She complimented my garden. She asked about a photograph on the mantel, the one of Connor at his grade 8 graduation, and she said she had never seen that one before. I noticed she did not ask about the painting beside it, which was an original by a Quebec artist I had bought quietly at an auction in 2017. It would have meant nothing to her. Most things that hold real value look ordinary to people who are only watching for the obvious signals. Over dinner, Connor mentioned that they were thinking of expanding, a second property, maybe a small multiplex if they could find the right one. He spoke with confidence about cap rates and cash flow, and I listened carefully and asked a few questions, and he answered them with the patience of someone explaining things to a person who probably did not understand. I did not correct him. After dinner, when Felicity had gone to bed early with a headache, Connor and I sat in the living room with tea the way we used to when he was in his 20s, and still came to me with things that troubled him. He seemed almost himself for a while. And then he said something that I have turned over many times since. He said, "I just want you to know that the dinner, the speech, I know it landed wrong. I was trying to be funny and it came out differently than I meant it to." I looked at him. I said, "Tell me what you meant it to be." He did not have an answer for that. He looked at his tea. He said he was sorry if it had hurt me. I told him what I had told myself on the drive home from Montreal, that an apology that cannot explain itself is not an apology. It is a request for the other person to stop making them feel guilty. I said it gently. I watched it land. He looked like a boy again for a moment, and I felt the particular ache of loving someone through your disappointment in them. He left the next morning earlier than planned. Felicity was quiet on the way out. By summer, the cracks in their project were wider. The renovation had fallen further behind. The contractor had restructured and could not complete the work on the original terms. Connor was stressed in a way he was trying very hard not to show. He called more often, not to talk exactly, but to be near something familiar. I think he had started to sense, without being able to name it, that the ground was less solid than he had believed. What happened at the August board meeting of Douglas's development company is not something I witnessed directly, but I know what was on the table because it was my holding company's interests that were being discussed. Douglas had grown increasingly frustrated with the revised management terms and had begun quietly looking for alternative property management arrangements. What he discovered during the process of vetting potential new contractors was that several of the firms he had been in contact with over the past 3 years had indirect ownership connections that traced, eventually, to a numbered Ontario company. A company he had shaken hands with, signed contracts with, depended on without ever attaching it to a face. His legal team did the research. It took them longer than it should have. When Douglas finally understood whose numbered company he had been working with, he went very quiet. I know this because my property manager, who had been in those meetings, told me that Douglas had sat down heavily in his chair and said nothing for almost a full minute. I was told he asked if it was a coincidence. It was not. Felicity called me 2 days later. Her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before, careful and tight, like someone picking their way across ice they are not sure will hold. She asked if we could meet. She said Connor didn't know she was calling. I said I would be happy to meet. We met for lunch at a cafe in the Glebe on a Thursday in September. She arrived before me, which I noted. She had ordered tea. She did not look like someone who had spent a great deal of time thinking about this kind of moment. She looked like someone who had spent too much time thinking about this kind of moment and had arrived at it exhausted. She did not waste time on small talk. She said she needed to understand the situation. She said that her father was in the middle of a contract renegotiation that was affecting his operations significantly, and that his team had flagged a connection she wanted to understand. She said it carefully, watching my face. I let her finish. I held my cup with both hands. I said, "What would you like to know?" She said, "Did you do this on purpose?" I said, "Felicity, I have been building my business for 19 years. Every decision I have made in that time has been deliberate." She sat with that for a moment. Then she asked why I had not told Connor. I said that was a fair question, and she deserved a fair answer. I told her that I'd spent many years watching my son measure my worth by the surface of things, that I had raised him alone, kept him clothed and fed and educated, stayed up through illnesses and helped him through failures, and that the value of those years had been reduced at a dinner table in Montreal to a punchline about coupons and a used car. I told her that I was not angry, exactly. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something older than that. I told her that a person spends a long time deciding how much of herself to share with people who have already decided how to see her. She was quiet for a while. She looked out the window. She looked back at me. She said, "He loves you. He just doesn't know how to say that while also wanting to impress people who wouldn't understand it." I told her that was probably true, and that it was also insufficient. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I was not going to do anything to harm Connor. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it matters. What I had built was mine. The way it intersected with Douglas's business was the result of decisions he had made freely, without knowing who was on the other side. I was not going to unwind that simply to spare him discomfort, but I was also not going to use it to destroy him. That had never been the point. I told Felicity that what I wanted was simple and had always been simple. I wanted my son to understand what I had actually built, not as a threat, not as a performance. Just the truth of who I was, which he had never thought to ask about. She was crying a little by then. She wiped her eyes quickly, the way women do when they have decided they are not going to cry and their face has disagreed. She said she would talk to him. I told her I appreciated that. I paid for lunch. Connor called me 3 days later. His voice was different from any version of it I could remember. It had gone quiet in a way that sounded like something being put down. He asked if he could come see me that weekend. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday morning. He sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee. I did not make it easy for him, and I do not apologize for that, because there is a particular kind of mother's mercy that involves making your child sit with the weight of a thing long enough to understand it. He had questions. I answered them honestly. When he asked why I had never told him, I showed him the same thing I would have shown anyone: the records, the properties, the company structure, the years of quiet work that had been happening in the same small split level he had once been embarrassed by. He was silent for a long time. He said, "I had no idea." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry, Mum, not just for Montreal, for a long time." I told him I believed him. I told him also that an apology without change is just a statement, and that what I needed from him, what I had always needed, was not to be invisible in his life, not to be something he managed. I told him the door was open, but the terms had changed, and that the terms were simply this: he would have to learn to see me. He nodded. His eyes were red. He is still his father's height, and sometimes I forget that. And then he stands up, and I remember. That was 8 months ago. He calls more now. He asks questions he should have asked years ago. He came with me to walk through a property I was considering in Kingston last spring, and for 3 hours he was simply my son, curious and present, asking me how I learned to read a balance sheet and what I looked for in a neighborhood and when I knew a deal was worth the risk. I told him everything he wanted to know. Douglas's contract was renegotiated. The terms are what they are. He is a professional and he has managed it professionally, and we have never once discussed what his son-in-law said at a dinner table 3 years ago in Montreal. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. Vivienne has never mentioned the scarves. I think about the woman I was at that rehearsal dinner in Montreal, sitting with my hands flat on my lap and my face arranged into something neutral. I think about the years before that, working at an engineering firm, driving my son to hockey practice, tucking money into investments that nobody thought to ask about. I think about how little most people knew about me and how certain they were of what they knew. People often mistake a quiet life for a small one. They see modest clothing and a practical car and a woman who does not speak about money, and they build a whole picture from that. The picture feels true because it is clean and simple and confirms what they already believed. What they do not see is the 19 years of deliberate, patient work happening underneath the surface. What they do not see is that the woman who clips coupons might be clipping them because she is very, very good at understanding the value of every dollar, and what happens when you let enough of them accumulate quietly over time. The night Connor called me an embarrassment in front of 50 people, I drove home on the 417 in the dark, and I let myself feel everything I was feeling, and then I put it somewhere careful and I kept driving. I did not need to announce myself. I did not need to perform strength for an audience that had already decided what they were looking at. Real power, the kind that actually holds when things get hard, does not need a room's attention to exist. It just needs time and someone patient enough to wait. I still think about that drive home from Montreal, the 417 at night, the city lights thinning out behind me, and the particular silence of a car after something has happened that cannot be unhappened. Connor had no idea what he had done. That is what stayed with me longest. Not the cruelty of it, but the casualness. He had reached into 19 years of sacrifice and used it to get a laugh from people he had known for 18 months. That kind of carelessness does not come from nowhere. It comes from a long habit of not having to look clearly at the person in front of you. What I have come to understand, sitting with this long enough to see it honestly, is that what happened at that dinner was never really about money. It was about what we choose to see in the people closest to us, and what we choose not to. Connor had decided somewhere along the way that I was a certain kind of woman, practical, modest, useful in the background. He had built a picture of me from the surface of things and stopped looking deeper because it cost him nothing not to. That is a failure of character, not a dramatic one. Not the kind that makes headlines, just the quiet, daily failure of a person who has gotten comfortable with a version of someone they love that is smaller than the truth. The reason everything unfolded the way it did was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was the result of choices compounding over time on both sides. I had spent 19 years making deliberate, patient decisions. I had built something real because I understood in a way that hardship teaches you and comfort rarely does, that security is not given to you. You construct it, carefully, with the materials available to you, and you do not stop when it gets tedious or when no one is watching. That is the only honest answer I have when people ask how I got where I am. I kept going when there was no audience for it. Connor had also been making choices. Every time he let a small cruelty pass without correcting it. Every time he chose his fiancée's family's approval over a phone call home. Every small abdication of honesty about who raised him and what that cost. Those choices accumulated too, and they led him, inevitably, to a room in Montreal where he turned his mother into a punchline and felt fine about it. Actions move forward, not backward. What you practice becomes what you are. What I wanted from my son, after all of it, was not that he feel ashamed. Shame is not a teacher, it is a trap. What I wanted was for him to develop the willingness to see people clearly, including me, including himself, to use his mind honestly instead of conveniently, to understand that intelligence is not only what you know, but what you are willing to examine. He is capable of that. I have always believed he is capable of it. The question was whether comfort would keep getting in the way. The morning he sat at my kitchen table and looked at 19 years of quiet work laid out in front of him, something in him changed. Not completely, not permanently, maybe, but I watched him put down the picture he had been carrying of me and try, for the first time in a long time, to look at the actual person. That is where everything real begins, not in the grand gesture, not in the formal apology, but in the willingness to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong about someone you should have known better. I do not need him to be grateful. I need him to be honest. Those are not the same thing, and one of them actually lasts.